Emma stood at the edge of the living room, staring into the darkness of the hallway. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through the empty house. She was alone, or so she thought. Every creak, every whispering gust of wind seemed to be filled with an unseen presence. Her breath hitched in her throat as the old wooden door slowly creaked open on its own. Something was in the house with her, something that shouldn't be there. Emma was a 28-year-old science teacher, deeply logical and practical. She didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. Her family had moved to a new house a few months ago, leaving her behind in their old home on Elm Street to finish packing their belongings. The house was filled with memories from her childhood, but over time it had become run down and eerie. She had no fear of being alone, assuming all the strange noises in the old house were simply the result of age and creaky floorboards. Emma had always been the brave one in her family, the one who stayed calm in stressful situations. But tonight felt different. There was a heavy stillness in the air, something unnatural that made her skin prickle. Her family was out for the evening, leaving her to finish the packing alone. What she didn't know was that something far more sinister had been waiting for this moment, when she would be completely alone. As Emma sorted through old boxes in the attic, she stumbled upon a dusty photograph that made her pause. In the picture, she was about 6 years old, standing outside the house, smiling. But what caught her eye was the shadowy figure behind her, vague, distorted, and almost invisible, but there. Emma didn't remember anyone standing behind her when the photo was taken. Who was it? Confused but still skeptical, she brushed it off as a trick of the light in the old photograph. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. Lights flickered, and strange shadows began to move at the corners of her vision. Still, she tried to reason with herself, blaming it on faulty wiring or her imagination. But then the whispers started. Faint at first, like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. The more she tried to ignore them, the louder they became until it felt like someone was standing right behind her, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Unable to ignore the eerie sensations anymore, Emma decided to leave. But as she walked toward the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. No matter how hard she pulled, the door wouldn't budge. She was trapped inside the house. Panic surged through her as she ran to the windows, only to find them sealed tight. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Turning around, Emma saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, its body covered in shadows, face blurred as if it didn't belong to this world. It slowly moved toward her, its footsteps deliberate and heavy. Her legs felt like they were stuck in place as the figure approached. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she finally understood. This entity had been waiting for her. It had followed her since childhood, feeding off her fear. And now, with no one around, it had come to claim her. She backed away, stumbling over boxes and old furniture, but the entity kept coming closer, its presence overwhelming. Suddenly, the attic door flung open by itself, and the figure pointed upward. The attic was where it all began, where it had first attached itself to her as a child. Desperate to escape, Emma had no choice but to confront her past. Trembling, she climbed the stairs to the attic, where the temperature dropped to near freezing. The entity followed her, its distorted face finally becoming clear. It wasn't human, its features were twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. In the attic, Emma found another photograph lying on the floor, a photo of her as a baby, cradled in her mother's arms, with the same shadowy figure lurking in the background. It had always been with her, waiting for her to be alone. As Emma stood frozen, the entity slowly reached out, its icy fingers grazing her skin. A wave of memories flooded her mind, moments from her childhood when she felt watched, when she felt something was wrong, but had always ignored it. Now she knew. The entity had been haunting her for years, waiting for this moment. The last thing Emma heard before her world went dark was the sound of her own scream. The next morning, her family returned to find the house silent. Emma was nowhere to be found, and her belongings were scattered as if she had vanished in the middle of packing. On the attic floor, they found the old photograph of her as a child, except this time, Emma wasn't in the picture at all. Only the shadow remained. Jack stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth when something caught his eye. The reflection wasn't right. His movements were slightly delayed. He blinked, but the reflection kept staring at him, smiling in a way that sent chills down his spine. It was then that he realized he wasn't alone. Jack was an ordinary 35-year-old accountant. He lived in a small town, far from any big city, and lived alone after his wife passed away a year ago. He had moved back in with his parents to deal with the grief, but now they had left on a weekend trip, leaving him by himself for the first time in a long time. Jack wasn't too concerned about being alone, though the house had always made him feel uneasy since his childhood. The mirrors in the house had always made Jack uncomfortable, but he had never been able to explain why. As a kid, he would avoid looking into them for too long, especially at night. His mother had told him stories of how mirrors could capture spirits, but Jack had always dismissed them as old wives' tales. Now, as a grown man, he was alone in the house, and those old childhood fears began to creep back. After spending the day trying to keep busy, Jack found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror. As he brushed his teeth, something felt off. He moved his hand, and his reflection followed, but not perfectly. The movements were delayed, just by a fraction of a second, and his reflection's smile grew wider than his own. Confused and unnerved, Jack leaned closer, staring into his own eyes. That's when he noticed it. The reflection's eyes weren't his. They were darker, almost empty, and the smile didn't belong to him either. Backing away from the mirror, Jack's heart raced. He tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe he was just tired, maybe he had imagined it. But the more he avoided the mirrors, the more he felt like something was watching him from within them. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt drawn back to the mirrors in the house. He got up, determined to cover them, but as he approached the hallway mirror, his reflection moved on its own. It reached out toward him, its hand pressing against the glass, as if trying to break free. Terrified, Jack stumbled backward, but the reflection stepped out of the mirror, emerging into the room like a shadow that had come to life. Its eyes were hollow, and its face twisted into a grotesque smile. This wasn't just a reflection, it was something else, something that had been trapped in the mirrors, waiting for the right moment to escape. The entity lunged at Jack, grabbing him with icy fingers. He could feel its cold breath on his skin as it whispered in his ear, telling him how it had been waiting all these years. It had been trapped in the mirrors, bound by some ancient curse, and now, with his family gone, it was free. Desperate to fight back, Jack ran to the attic, where he remembered his mother had once kept an old dusty box of superstitious charms. He searched frantically until he found a small, cracked mirror. His mother had once told him that this mirror could trap evil spirits. The entity followed him, its twisted form growing more menacing. Just as it reached for him, Jack held up the small mirror. The entity screamed, its reflection being sucked into the glass. The house shook, and the air grew thick with the sound of cracking glass. Jack collapsed in exhaustion, thinking it was over. But as he looked into the small mirror, he realized the entity wasn't gone. It was still there, trapped, but now it had his face. For the rest of his life, Jack would never be able to look into a mirror again without seeing the reflection of the twisted, hollow-eyed version of himself staring back, waiting for the chance to escape once more. The soft crackling of static from the baby monitor filled the room, but then it changed. At first, it was just a whisper barely audible. Then came the voice. "Come closer," it hissed. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She was alone in the house, and her baby was sleeping upstairs. Or so she thought. Sarah was a new mother, barely getting used to the sleepless nights and constant worry that came with her newborn baby, Emily. At 32, Sarah and her husband, Ben, had just moved into an old Victorian house in the countryside, hoping to raise their daughter in peace away from the city. Ben had to leave for a business trip over the weekend, leaving Sarah alone with Emily for the first time in the new house. The house had its quirks, creaky floors, strange drafts, but Sarah brushed them off as typical for an old place. She had never been the superstitious type. However, over the past few nights, she had noticed odd noises coming from the baby's room, faint whispers over the baby monitor that made her uneasy. She told herself it was just interference, maybe from a neighbor's device. That night, after putting Emily to bed, Sarah settled into the living room. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table, crackling softly as usual. But suddenly, the static turned into something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable, was coming through. "Come closer," it said, slow and deliberate. Sarah stared at the monitor, her heart racing. She quickly ran upstairs to check on Emily, only to find her fast asleep in her crib. Breathing a sigh of relief, Sarah returned to the living room, but the unease lingered. As she sat back down, the voice came again, louder this time. "Come closer. She's waiting." Terrified, Sarah grabbed the monitor and rushed back upstairs. The room was colder than before, and as she approached Emily's crib, she noticed something that sent chills down her spine: handprints on the window. They weren't hers, and the window hadn't been opened since they moved in. The voice from the monitor grew louder, filling the room with whispers that seemed to surround her. Sarah backed away, clutching Emily tightly in her arms. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Its eyes were hollow, and its face was twisted in a grotesque smile. It was watching her, waiting. Desperate, Sarah ran to the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The figure moved closer, its voice now echoing through the monitor. "I've been waiting for her." Panicking, Sarah remembered an old story her grandmother used to tell her about restless spirits drawn to newborns, seeking to take them away. She had never believed in such things, but now, faced with the undeniable presence in her home, she had no choice but to fight back. Holding Emily close, Sarah recited a prayer her grandmother had taught her. The figure hissed, retreating into the shadows. But it wasn't gone, it was waiting for its chance, waiting for her to falter. Just as Sarah thought she had banished the entity, the baby monitor crackled one last time. "She's mine," it whispered. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Emily's crib empty. Her baby was gone, and in her place was the monitor, its screen flickering with the image of the twisted figure, cradling a baby in its arms. No one ever saw Emily again. Sarah was left with the horrifying knowledge that something had taken her daughter, something beyond her control. And every time she turned on the baby monitor, she could still hear the voice calling out to her, waiting for her to come closer. David glanced at the clock. Mitnicht. The hospital halls were quiet, too quiet. As he made his rounds, a soft giggle echoed down the corridor. His breath caught in his throat. He was supposed to be alone tonight, everyone else had gone home. Or at least, that's what he thought. David had been working as a night security guard at St. Mary's Hospital for nearly 5 years. At 45, he was used to the eerie silence of the empty hallways, the quiet hum of medical machines, and the occasional creak of doors that moved on their own. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted, but David had never taken the rumors seriously. He had always been a practical man, more focused on his duties than on ghost stories. However, over the last few months, strange things had begun to happen. Items would go missing, lights would flicker for no reason, and David often felt as if he were being watched. He chalked it up to the stress of working long night shifts. Tonight, however, was different. His co-workers had left early due to a power outage in the area, leaving him completely alone. As David made his usual rounds, the lights in the maternity ward flickered again. He sighed, thinking it was just another electrical issue. But then he heard it, a child's giggle, soft and playful, coming from one of the empty rooms. His heart skipped a beat. There were no patients in that ward tonight. Curious but cautious, David walked down the hall, his flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the hospital. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. He stopped in front of room 312, the one that had been locked and unused for years. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed the door slightly ajar. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty except for an old crib that had been left behind. David's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment he saw it, a little girl, standing by the crib, her back to him. She was humming a lullaby, her voice soft and eerie. David froze, unable to move. The little girl turned slowly, her face pale and emotionless, eyes dark as night. "Where's my mommy?" she whispered, her voice sending chills through his body. He knew then that this was no ordinary child. The stories he had heard from his co-workers flooded his mind. Years ago, a woman had died in childbirth in that very room, her baby never found. Some said her spirit had stayed behind, searching for her lost child. Others claimed that the baby itself had become something else, something evil. David backed away, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The little girl's eyes locked onto his, and she began to move toward him, her footsteps silent but deliberate. The room grew colder, and David's breath came out in white puffs. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. In desperation, he remembered the rosary his mother had given him years ago, which he kept in his pocket for luck. Clutching it tightly, he muttered a prayer, hoping it would help. The little girl stopped, her face contorting in anger. "You can't take her from me," she hissed, her voice no longer that of a child. The shadows in the room swirled around her, and the crib shook violently. David's heart raced as he realized that the entity wasn't the little girl at all. It was the spirit of the mother, twisted and vengeful, searching for her lost baby. And now it wanted him. Just as David thought he was free, the lights flickered out completely. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed the room was the twisted figure of the mother lunging toward him. The next morning, the day shift workers found David's flashlight lying on the floor of room 312. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and David was nowhere to be found. The only sign of him was the rosary, lying in the crib, covered in a thin layer of frost. From that day on, no one dared to enter room 312 again. But at night, the staff still hears the faint sound of a lullaby echoing through the empty halls, followed by the soft giggle of a child who is no longer there.